Hello everyone, my name is Bob Barton and I'm speaking to you from Toronto. I've had the great pleasure of telling stories in Alberta on several occasions, in Edmonton and in Calgary, especially in Calgary and many of the schools there. In 1986, I was telling stories in Pond Inlet at the top of Baffin Island. It's March, very cold, and I noticed that the folk who live there wore the most beautiful, colorful knit hats. So I asked if I could buy one and was told that, well, somebody would have to make me one. And fortunately, a woman by the name of Martha Ukumiak agreed to do just that. And this is the hat that she made for me. It's an absolute treasure. I would never ever part with this hat. And every time I look at this hat, I think about a young boy who received a gift of a new hat from his mom for winter. The boy's name was Anders. And Anders' mom knit him a hat that was mainly red, but there was a little patch of green over the left eye because his mom had run out of the red yarn. And there was a tassel on the hat, and the tassel was blue. And on the day the hat was finished, Anders put it on his head. And his brothers and sisters gathered around and they said, "Oh, Anders, this is a really fine hat. You realize, don't you, that Mother makes the very best hats in the whole world?" "Well, I know that," said Anders, "and I'm going out and I'm going to show my hat off to everyone I meet." And so he skipped out the front door and along the road. Now, the first person he met that day was a tree trimmer. The man was up cutting dead branches from the trees, and at the moment he was seated at the base of the tree having a cup of tea from his thermos. And when he saw Anders coming along the road, he leapt to his feet and he took his plastic safety helmet from his head, and he bowed so low that his nose nearly touched the ground, and he called out to Anders, "Young man, you look like a prince in that hat. I'll make you a deal. I'll give you my construction hat and $10 cash if you'll sell me that hat." But Anders put his hands on his hat and he said, "Oh no, that this is the hat that Mother made. She makes the very best hats in the world, you know. I wouldn't sell this to anyone." And he skipped along the road. Well, just up ahead, there was a very large teenage boy, and he had a jackknife in one hand and a piece of wood in the other, and he was whittling. And when he saw Anders, he said, "Hey, kid, hold it." And Anders froze. And the teenage boy walked around Anders, and he flicked the tassel on Anders' hat with his thumb and his forefinger. And he said, "This is a really neat hat. I'll make you trade. My knife for your hat." Now, I have to admit that Anders was tempted. I mean, he realized that owning a knife was a sign of being practically a grown-up. He would love to have had one. But when he looked carefully, he could see that the bone handle had a crack in it, and the tip of the knife blade was chipped. And so he put his hands on his hat and he said, no deal. It's not good enough. Furthermore, this is the hat that Mother made. She makes the best hats in the world. I'm not trading this for anything." And he ran off while the teenage boy made ugly faces at him behind his back. Now, the next person Anders met that morning was a little old lady. And she was dressed in a long red skirt that reached right down to the toes of her boots. And when she saw Anders, she said, "Young man, you look like a prince in that hat." And she curtsied so that her skirt swished over the toes of her boots. And then she said, "You know, young fella, with a hat as fine as that, you could go to a fancy dress ball at the king's palace." And Anders thought to himself, interesting. Everyone says I look like a prince in this hat. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the palace. I'm going to show my hat to the king. And so he started off in the direction of the palace. But as he got close, he could see that there were two very tall guards standing at attention by the palace gates, and they had shiny helmets on their heads. And as soon as Anders got a bit too close, one of the guards stepped out, stomped his foot, and said, "Halt! Where do you think you're going?" And Anders said, I've got a new hat. Mother made it. She makes the best hats in the world, you know. I've come to show my hat to the king." And the guard leaned over and he said, "No, son. You are not going to show your hat to the king. You see, in order to go in and visit the king, you have to be dressed in your finest clothes. You're dressed in play clothes. You turn around and go home. Now it just happened that the princess was playing on her swing set inside the palace gates. She heard this, and she ran through the gate, and she went up to Anders, and she said, "That is a splendid hat. That counts as being dressed in your finest clothes." And she grasped Anders' wrist, pulled him past the guards, and they ran across the cobblestones, up the steps, and into the palace. Now the palace was very grand, as most palaces are, and Anders had never ever set foot in a palace in his life before. And as they went along the halls, he could see there were mirrors that extended from the floor right up to the high ceilings, and there were gold chandeliers everywhere, and all of the servants were dressed in gold uniforms. And as Anders and the princess moved along the hall, all of the servants bowed deeply, and Anders said, "They think I'm a prince." And then the princess approached two large gold doors, and she opened the doors, and they stepped into the throne room. And there were tables that were set up for some special occasion, and there were huge silver bowls, bigger than your bathtub, on those tables, filled with chocolates and every kind of candy you can possibly think of. And the princess led Anders past the tables, and they went up onto a platform, and there were two gold chairs. And she said to Anders, "You sit in this chair, and I'll sit beside you." And as soon as Anders had made himself comfortable, the princess said, "Now, when you are in this room, you must remove your hat." But Anders clasped his hat to his head, and he said no, because he thought, if I take off my hat, no one's going to believe I'm a prince. And then the princess leaned over and she said, "If I give you a nice kiss, will you take off your hat?" Well, the princess was lovely. I mean, Anders would dearly like to have been kissed by her, but he said, "No." And then the princess reached up, and she undid her gold necklace, and she fastened the necklace around Anders' neck, and she said, "Now, will you take off your hat?" "No." And then she reached into one of the silver bowls and scooped out handfuls of chocolate, and she stuffed the pockets of Anders' jacket with the chocolates, and she said, "Now will you take off your hat?" "No." And suddenly there was the sound of trumpets, and the gold doors at the end of the room opened, and the king entered. And the king was wearing a gold crown with jewels in it, and he wore purple robes that reached right down to the floor. And when he saw Anders sitting on his throne, he said, "Young man, that's a very fine hat you have there." "I know, sir," said Anders. "Mother made it. She makes the best hats in the world, you know." And the king said, "Yes, I can see that." And the king started to move in Anders' direction, and he came closer and closer and closer and closer. And then, when he was standing right in front of Anders, he reached up, lifted the crown from his head, held it out to Anders and said, "I would like to make a trade. I would like to trade my gold crown for your fine woolen hat." Well, for the first time that day, Anders was suddenly scared. He was absolutely terrified, because you see, Anders knew that kings were powerful. And Anders knew that the king could order him to give up the hat that Mother had made. And then all of a sudden, he made his move. He dove off the throne and under the tables. He crawled on his hands and knees till he reached the door. He dashed out into the hallway and started towards the stairs. As he ran down the stairs, the gold necklace flew from his neck. Chocolates flew from his pockets. He reached the courtyard. He started to run towards the gates. The guards made ready to catch him. But at the last second, Anders skirted around them like a frightened rabbit, and he didn't stop running till he was safe and sound inside his own house. And he leapt into his mother's arms, and he cried, and he cried, and he cried. And after he had a good cry, he felt better. And then he explained to his mother everything that had happened to him that day. And his eldest brother was standing there listening, and he said, "Anders, what kind of a fool are you? You refused a king's crown for your hat? Anders, if you'd brought the crown home, we could have sold it. We could have had enough money to live well for the rest of our lives. What have you done?" And suddenly, Anders felt all hot inside, and tears began to well up in his eyes. And he looked up at his mother and he said, "Mother, did I do the wrong thing?" And his mother said, "No. No, Anders, you did not do the wrong thing. Even if you were dressed in a king's royal robes from the top of your head to the tip of your toes, you wouldn't look any better than you do in your woolen hat." Suddenly, Anders felt brave again, because he knew for sure now that the hat Mother had made was indeed the best hat in the entire world.